We welcome all of you this morning to a place we'd rather not be, to talk about the events in Ferguson and how they connect to the rest of the nation. And the reality, we believe, is that the non-indictment against Officer Wilson and the decision that there was no grounds for a probable cause for a charge, at least an indictment. And let me stop there for a minute. The civil rights community had never asked for the officer to be proved to be guilty first and then proven innocent. The question before the nation with the grand jury was whether or not an indictment to have the case properly adjudicated in the courts would occur. Adjudicated in the courts would occur. The DA could have done that himself. Any DA has the right or the authority to do that themselves. And I want to talk about what, in fact, that has meant in this case. In reality, the non-indictment against Officer Wilson is an indictment and a charge against a system that is not willing to fully address the racial and discriminatory flaws that still exist.
Yeah, that's correct.
This non-indictment is an indictment.
Yes.
It is an indictment on a DA who is elected to be an advocate for the people and an advocate for the search of truth, as opposed to an advocate for the perpetrator. What we learned from the DA's presentation last night is that Mike Brown's family did not have an advocate in the secret rooms of the grand jury. Normally in that case, the cases like this, and legal experts have said the DA would go in and ask for a particular indictment. But when the DA simply gathered all the information and pushed it off to the grand jury, many legal experts are saying that that in itself was kind of what we call a predetermining the outcome in this particular case, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. What we saw last night is an indictment on a DA who told the rest of the nation, in essence, that a kid, I want us to remember that, okay, if you're 6'2" or 6'5", if you're 17, you're a kid.
That's right. That's right.
That a kid, a possible suspect in some form of a robbery, who is unarmed, is a justifiable candidate for death. It's an indictment against that kind of rationale.
Yes.
By this standard, every suspect would never make it to jail. It's an indictment against a system that admits on camera there was conflicting reports, conflicting testimony. And because it's conflicting, that's a justification for not having an indictment and allowing the conflicts to be worked out within the confines of the courtroom. When many legal experts say in every case there are conflicting testimonies, that's why you have a court system where you can have cross-examination and examination and a true examination of all of the facts.
Yeah, that's right.
What we saw last night is an indictment on a system that still has not answered this fundamental question: how far was Mike Brown from the officer when he was shot unarmed in the head? this non-indictment is an indictment against a system that too often tolerates and perpetuates discrimination in the carrying out of judicial mandates within our system. You should know that in St. Louis County, there are 90 municipalities. In St. Louis County, they issued 29,072 tickets for traffic offenses. That Florence collected about $3 million in fines and county costs in the fiscal year 2013. And 13% of its 2013 revenue comes from traffic tickets.
That's right.
And Florence, as of last year, held more than 11,000 outstanding warrants, and it's called poverty ticketing in that area, because the system is set up to disproportionately discriminate and profile the poor.
Yeah.
Because that's the way the system helps to fund the county municipality. That needs to be known. It needs to be known that this non-indictment is an indictment against a system, the flaws of the criminal justice system, that still refuses to deal with some very real facts, not just in Ferguson. A 2012 study produced said that every 36 hours, police officers, security guards, self-appointed vigilantes kill. Every 28 hours, a black person was killed at the hand of law enforcement. Every 28 hours. 313 African Americans in 2012 alone, and many of them unarmed. The non-indictment is an indictment of a system that too often tolerates and perpetuates the criminalization of black men.
Yeah.
That's why the NAACP earlier this year put out this report entitled Born Suspect. The reality of having to deal with being guilty before proven innocent just because of the accident of birth and color.
That's right.
And this report details statistically how that is yet an ongoing reality in this culture. This non-indictment is an indictment against a system where too many in policy positions seems to be operating from a bell curve perspective. And I asked the media to go back and remember the bell curve book, that racist book by Charles Murray, that actually suggested that you have to have an enormous amounts of prisons and you have to racially profile, and there's no need to work at changing the structure of community because black and brown people are genetically predisposed to criminality. And you could hear that same language on Fox News last night. And by some of the people who were commenting, they were actually resurrecting and reviving the flawed analysis of the bell curve. This non-indictment is an indictment against a system that has created what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, where she says America has not yet dealt with the reality that today there are more African Americans under the correctional control in prison or in jail, on probation or parole than there were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. There are millions of African Americans cycling in and out of the prisons and jails under the correctional control, and in major cities, more than half of the working age African American men are either under correctional control or branded as felons, and thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives.
That's right.
This non-indictment is an indictment on America's continuing refusal to deal fully with the continuing realities of racial discrimination and profiling in our criminal justice system. And we're plagued with it here. It's an indictment right here on the system in North Carolina. Racial profiling is real in this state. We've seen it here in this state by a study that was done by the UNC, where it talks about how African American males are 3 and 4 times more likely to be stopped. Right here in North Carolina, we have shootings by police that are still under investigation in Fayetteville and Durham. Our president here in the Durham chapter and the work that's being done right here. We have a criminal justice system that is racially biased. According to one study, North Carolina police are 3 times more likely to arrest African Americans for seatbelt violations, and more than twice as likely to search African Americans than whites after a speeding stop. This non-indictment is an indictment on our system right here.
Yes.
A system where legislators who know, where the courts have said that race is used in the application of the death penalty. And yet we have legislators who repeal the Racial Justice Act in a state where you have had over 5 black men found innocent who were on death row, who would have been murdered by the state in our name, who've now been simply released. No money, no anything. Just said, oops, we were wrong. And we don't know how many are still there, and we don't know how many innocent folk we have killed. But what we know is we have a system, according to the courts, not according to us, that still utilizes race in the application of the death penalty, and yet you have legislators who would repeal a law and attempting to deal with that reality. This non-indictment is an indictment on a system, remember those of you in the media, that would lock James Johnson up, a 17-year-old from Wilson, accused of murder, would lock him up for 4 years without a trial, only later for him to be released as innocent. It's an indictment against a system where a son of this state, John McNeil, think about it, shot an armed intruder on his property in Georgia.
That's right.
And 2 white police officers said it was self-defense. And 274 days later, a rogue DA decided to prosecute him and sent John to prison for life. And it took us and his wife on her deathbed 6 years to free him. It's an indictment against a system that would see a black boy hanging in an all-white, predominantly white, known to be drug-active community in Bladenboro, hanging, and where the system would quickly close the case and would not allow pictures to be taken on the scene, where a pathologist now has said, an independent pathologist, that the physics of a self-inflicted hanging don't even work in this particular case. And now where the state medical examiner is having to go back and say, if I had had all of this information, if the local medical examiner had not quickly said suicide, I would have never ruled the cause of death suicide. This non-indictment is an indictment that too often our system wants to dismiss the preponderance of evidence in both statistics and actual cases that proves that our theories about racial disparities in the criminal justice system are not fragments of people's imagination, but rooted in reality of legitimate discontent. And while we disagree in the NAACP with those who would promote violence in order to deal with violence, the reality is there is, as Dr. King would say, legitimate discontent.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
And that's why all over America, you are hearing what you heard at the first Christmas when brown and black babies were being killed by flawed judicial rulings by a king called Herod. And the first Christmas was not lights and cute images of red and white. The first Christmas was filled with the blood of innocent boys.
Yes.
And the scripture declares you heard the voice of Rachel crying out in Ramah, refusing to be comforted. And that is why, because this non-indictment is an indictment on America's need to deal with racialized, the racial injustices in our criminal justice system, you are hearing the voice of Rachel, the voice of Mike Brown's mama and daddy, the voice of Trayvon's mama, the voice of people from California to Missouri to North Carolina to New York, crying and refusing to be comforted and saying we can no longer just allow funeral after funeral after funeral after funeral and killing after killing after killing after killing to go on. And America not render a verdict on herself.
That's right. That's right.
That it's time.
It's time
to address the continuing inequalities in our criminal justice system. And when you add to this racial discrimination and the deaths that it's producing in our criminal justice system, when too many episodes of cops gone crazy are happening, when we see the devaluation and the humanity of black boys and black men, when we see the power given to a cop being abused, the power of a badge and a gun and the ability to walk in your house with a warrant and remove any member of your family is too much power for a bigot and a trigger-happy police or person. And when you add to the systemic flaws in the criminal justice system, attacks on the poor, attacks on the sick, attacks on immigrants, attacks on the unemployed, and attacks on public education. In Ferguson and right here in North Carolina, I don't know if any of the media know that 47% of St. Louis's metro area's African-American men between 16 and 24 are unemployed, compared to, for young white men, 16% in a county where they use the most regressive form of taxes to fund program, which is sales tax. When you add all of this up, it is clear that America, in some ways, must indict herself.
Yeah.
At least those who are refusing to deal with this issue. And those of us, black and white, who recognize that we can no longer push this stuff under the rug, must declare that it's time for America, not just black America,
That's right.
but America,
That's right.
to reach the verdict that we must deal with the continuing flaws of racial injustice in this country.
Right.
America, not just black America, but America must do this.
Yeah.
And so in the NAACP, that is why, because this non-indictment is an indictment.
It is. It is. Yeah.
And this indictment must be taken under the perusal of the court of public opinion and the court of our halls of the legislature and government. And we must finally render the verdict that we must deal with this problem and deal with it now.
Yes.
The NAACP, number one, stands with the family of Mike Brown and all others.
That's right.
Don't you forget, members of the media, that St. Louis is the place where a man was arrested, falsely arrested, beat, bled on an officer's uniform, and was charged with destroying government property. Google that. Don't forget that there have been other deaths in these municipalities. So we're standing with those families. Number two, the NAACP issued a guide to strategic responses to the situation in Ferguson with about 20 other civil rights organizations. And we're going to give you a copy of that as well. We're calling for actions to promote reform and stop police abuse.
Yes.
We're calling for mandatory training on racial bias and police use of force. We're calling on the required use of police officer body-worn cameras to record every police-civilian encounter. We're calling for better accountability of the use and potential distribution and the use of federal military weapons by law and law enforcement. We're calling for greater oversight of police officers through the formation of a National Police Commission. We're calling for true citizen review boards in communities across this country. And we're calling for it from governor's offices all the way to the White House, and that is why on this Saturday, November the 29th, the NAACP and its Youth and College Division and adults will begin a 120-mile march from Ferguson to Jefferson City, Missouri, the capital, to dramatize not only what has happened in Missouri, but what's happening across this nation.
Yes.
We've already made plans. I've been in touch with those on the ground, and we're planning on, if all works well and we can get the flights out, to go there on the 28th and to be at the start of that march with other members from the state of North Carolina, and then to be back here and on the day of its conclusion, which I think is December the 6th, to have some special time of solidarity with those who are going to fight for the transformation of America in this area. Let me ask our new executive director, Reverend Michelle Laws, to also lay out for you something that's happening tonight and why it's happening, where it's happening, and then I'll take questions from members of the media.
Thank you, Dr. Barber. We are indeed deeply troubled, as our esteemed president has laid out and explained. And as the nation and the world has watched, we understand the hurt that many people are feeling. But we are troubled and discontented with the decision, not as a people who have no hope, but we do believe that working together, marching together, standing together, praying together, here in this state and across this nation with the people in Ferguson, that we will eventually see change happen. These are systems that have been in place for a long time that would allow a Mike Brown case to happen, a Trayvon Martin, and so many of the others. So tonight, because we do have hope in the midst of this deep pain that many people are feeling and have articulated by calling our state office, and that many of us have felt, we will hold a vigil tonight, a prayer vigil. It is an interdenominational vigil that will be held at Pullen Memorial Baptist Church in Raleigh, beginning at 6:30, and that's on Hillsborough Street. Again, it's Pullen Memorial Baptist Church in Raleigh. We are asking all members of the community who are available and who are willing and able to come and to join us. We will have a brief reflection by our president, Dr. William J. Barber II, and then following that we will have prayers that will be rendered by members representing a cross-section of faiths. So we will have a rabbi from the Jewish community, we will have members from the different denominations within the Protestant faith, and members of the Muslim and Islamic faith community. So we're asking everyone who can and who are available to join us tonight at 6:30 at Pullen Memorial Baptist Church. We are distraught in some ways, in many instances, and we are indeed troubled, but we have hope, and we will continue to stand in that hope and in our faith that justice will eventually prevail in this case and so many of the others.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Reverend Laws. Please know that this will also be an interracial. Nancy Petty deliberately called and said this needs to be a gathering where white and black people
Yes.
challenge the continuing reality of racial injustice. We've created an environment where in Ferguson, across this nation, 60% of folks, African Americans, 60–70% say there's no problem. There is a problem. 60–70% of whites says there's not a problem. I know when I went there, I met with white evangelicals, and they actually acknowledged that there was a deep problem, but you don't hear that in the media. And so it's important that we say we will deal with this matter as all people of God who have the responsibility to challenge systems of racial injustice wherever they exist. We also remember finally that the NAACP called early on for a special prosecutor because we saw what was happening. It took a special prosecutor to deal with the case of James Johnson here in this state. It has often taken special prosecutors, often taken federal review to deal with these issues. It amazed me that on yesterday, Tim Tyson wrote the last line of his new book about Emmett Till on the same day that this non-indictment came down. The reality is, the earlier argument was that Emmett Till had committed a crime, that he was in a store, and that in that store he had committed the crime of whistling, but at a white woman. But this analogy by this DA, that if you are a suspect in a crime, not guilty of it, a suspect, and you're young, and you're unarmed, and you're black, and you're challenged by a policeman, you at the same time become a candidate for justifiable death. That is a terribly flawed logic, and we cannot be comforted easily.
That's right.
We must deal with this situation, which is why further the NAACP has continued to support the call for a federal investigation in this matter and in the overall unpacking of what's going on in the Ferguson Police Department, but also police departments around the state. There's a federal case challenged by the NAACP against what's happening in Greensboro. Same thing is happening in places like Fayetteville. So we must continue right here in Durham.